Our next speaker is Joanne Hovis, who's the president of CTC Technology and Energy. She's a nationally recognized expert on broadband markets and public-private partnerships. Her firm advises states and dozens of cities through strategic planning, market analysis, and business modeling. She's testified before Congress on rural broadband, public-private partnerships, and the digital divide on numerous occasions. Every time I talk to her, I learn something new, and she clearly and cogently describes the types and uses of funding better than almost anybody else I've talked to. So one of the topics I definitely was excited to have her cover is funding, but she's also, again, an expert on public-private partnerships. So I'm thrilled to welcome Joanne Hovis to the stage to share her insights and perspective with us.
Thank you, Kelty, and thank you, Texas Rural Funders, for inviting me to be here at this marvelous event. It's always a pleasure to be in Texas, and I'm really glad to be here. Even in heels, I feel very short behind a podium, so I am going to see if I can make this work. And I have the enormous pleasure of speaking to you all today about a couple of my favorite topics. Most significantly, the moment we are in and the opportunity that is presented by this moment, and why I feel that this is such a thrilling time for communities throughout Texas and throughout the country. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts about what the moment presents in terms of the funding, the forms of funding, and how I encourage you to think about leveraging them and utilizing them, even though for those of you who are communities, some of them may never flow directly to you. You can still help to shape how they get distributed to your partners and to your collaborators and to the private companies that are working in your communities. And that is through public-private collaboration. I'm going to speak about that quite a bit too. Now, the risk in my case is that I could just talk and talk and talk and talk, and I could take up the rest of the day easily. So I'm going to keep an eye on the clock here, but I'm also going to ask Kelty to give me the sign when I need to stop talking. And I also am hopeful that we can have a discussion. I'll talk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then I would love to do this in a way where all of you can ask questions, but also share your own experiences that relate to some of the themes of what I'm talking about and the uniqueness of this moment and why there is so much promise. So that's my overall agenda for this opportunity to speak to all of you. And there's nothing I love more than the opportunity to speak to a group of motivated people about my favorite topic, broadband. So thank you. Let me start, I think, with, let me see if I can make this work. Where should I be pointing? You know what, if you, it may not be on. There we go. There we go. It's not working? That would be great if you don't mind. Thanks. So the first thought I want to share with you all is something you all already know, which is that there is no way to overstate the importance of what we are talking about here. In the incredibly brief life of the commercial internet, and think about that, the commercial internet is only 25 years old. That is less than half my lifetime. For most of us in the room, it's half our lifetime or less. Not for all of us, but for many of us. That is an unbelievably short period of time. Even in the life of our very young country, that is a short period of time. And in that period of time, this infrastructure transformed our economy and it transformed our democracy. And it transformed every single sector of our economy without exception. Mostly for the better, not always, but mostly for the better. It transformed our democracy as well in terms of participation and a variety of other things, also mostly for the better, although not always that either. And to give you a sense of just how big the stakes are when we talk about the internet and when we talk about broadband, I want to suggest that no matter what anyone's political persuasion, there is reason to see this as having been utterly transformative to our society, because there is no Obama presidency without the internet. And there is no Trump presidency without the internet. That's how big the consequences of this are. That is the degree to which the way in which we communicate with each other and the way in which we think about our country, our civic responsibilities, and everything else was transformed by this infrastructure. And when the consequences are quite that profound, for every aspect of American life, we have to take this very seriously, and we have to think about how do we ensure that this is available to every single American and accessible to every single American. And those two things are not necessarily the same thing. That's an important starting point for our conversation here, which is that availability is all about where is their infrastructure and where are their services. Does it come past my house, my business, my workplace, my institutions? Is it available to me there if I pay for it? And then, is it accessible? Is it affordable? Do I have the tools necessary to be able to access it? And of course, we know there are a remarkable number of Americans, including a great number of Texans, for whom it's available but not truly accessible because it's not affordable, or the skills are not there, or the devices are not available, and there are all kinds of other challenges. And those are the two big categories of effort that we have underway in the current moment, that we have as a thin silver lining of the pandemic crisis that we've all just lived through. We have a bipartisan consensus in Washington and in every single state capital. Think about that, by the way. Talk about remarkable. The words I just said, bipartisan consensus in Washington and in every state capital. When do you ever talk about that? When do you hear those words? It applies to broadband. And that bipartisan consensus is that we need infrastructure and services available to every American, and we need access in the form of adoption, in the form of and adoption means affordability, devices, digital skills, etc., for our low-income neighbors, for veterans among us, for seniors, for the people who would not otherwise necessarily have access for a variety of reasons. And those are the two big categories of funding, and those are the two big categories of bipartisan consensus that we have throughout the country. And in my observation, as an outsider, not a Texan, you absolutely have that bipartisan agreement in this state, and that is a marvelous base from which to build into your future. That is what gives me confidence about the fact that we will do this right as a nation and as individual states, is that we have that in place. That consensus has led to historic levels of funding, and thank goodness for that. Because for so many years, remember I said 25 years of the commercial internet. So I was fortunate to happen to get out of law school just as the commercial internet was born, sort of right time, right place for something incredibly exciting. But I feel like I've been an observer of the development of the internet, including the broadband internet, which is something that emerged over certain kinds of networks in the early 2000s. I've been an observer since the very beginning. And for so many years, those of us in this room who knew the consequences and the importance of this infrastructure felt like we were hitting our heads against a wall, right? Like, please pay attention, please, this is so important, this infrastructure, and making this infrastructure future-proof, building it for the long term. This was the argument we were making, and the response was frequently, it's just entertainment. Like, why are we talking about this? That lack of understanding, I think, is in the past. That is all gone. We are all in the same place in understanding the consequences and the importance of this. And in this current moment, what we have for the first time is a commitment in our state capitals and in Washington, D.C. to treat broadband infrastructure in the same way we treated every enabling infrastructure in the history of American prosperity and American development, starting with the Santa Fe Trail, continuing with canal systems, continuing with the interstate highway system, continuing with our investments in various kinds of shipping and other ways of enabling and supporting commerce and opportunity. And of course, the most important and I think best analogy, electrification of the entire United States 100 years ago. And that included rural electrification, and that included programs to make sure that electricity was not only for wealthy people, it was for everybody. And when we made that investment 100 years ago as a nation, based on a consensus that this was incredibly important, we made it based on a certain level of faith. And our faith was that we didn't know what electricity was going to enable. We knew it would allow for electric lighting at night. We knew that it would allow for us to see things at night that we didn't have previously, but we had no idea what was coming through most of the 20th century that would be dependent on electricity. And yet we made the investment anyway, and 100 years of American prosperity have been built on that investment. Think about what electricity meant. In 1930, nobody knew about things like dishwashers, washers and dryers, and vacuum cleaners that in the middle of the century changed the lives of American women, right? And made it possible for us, many of us in this room, to be here today because it freed us from certain kinds of things that before that were not possible absent electricity, right? That were simply a different level of effort. In 1930, when we electrified the country, we did not understand the things that would develop from an innovation standpoint in the 1960s and 70s that would change the way that we communicated, that were enabled by electricity. And by that I mean everything from the fax machine to the dial-up modem to the internet itself, which would never have happened, which would never have developed had we not had this core infrastructure. These were things that we could not have contemplated when we built that network 100 years ago. In the same way as today in 2022, we cannot really imagine the ways that our children and grandchildren will use this infrastructure in the future, but we know that our prosperity and our national competitiveness for the next 100 years will be based on it. And that is why we're making this investment, and that is why it is so critical. And I will share that this is the first moment, really, in many ways, that I have felt a little bit more relaxed about our competition with China in 15 years, because I feel like we have finally understood from an investment standpoint in infrastructure what it is going to take to compete with China. 7 years ago, in the days when I was still comfortable traveling to China, my husband and I went hiking in a remote part of the Great Wall, in areas around the Great Wall, entirely remote, very distant. We camped in an abandoned schoolhouse. It was like a 4-room schoolhouse where you could rent a spot to camp overnight. We had to bring in our own water because there was no drinkable water there, but there was a direct fiber connection to that location. And if you had given me a choice, by the way, between water and fiber, I would have gone with the fiber because I could bring the water, but I could not bring the internet. But that was an illustration to me, and here I was in this remote part of China reading about what was happening in the US Supreme Court, because it happened to be, in that spring period where all the decisions are coming out of the Supreme Court, and I felt so connected to home at the same time as I was about as far from home as I could possibly be. That was an illustration to me of how seriously and how astutely the Chinese government understands what the future is going to be built on, and now we do too. We have bipartisan consensus across the country that this is going to be the basis of our future too. We invented it, we created it, and finally, we are adequately investing in it. Now, obviously, I can go on this topic for a long time, and that was just my set of introductory remarks, so I should move on. All right, and I'm keeping an eye on the calendar. Let me share with you a few thoughts on the big picture about what is coming out of Washington, out of this bipartisan consensus about funding, and some themes of it, because I think they're really important as you start to position yourselves as communities and collaborations of public and private entities and so on, and as nonprofits who are going to be enormously influential in determining how your communities engage. I think these themes are important to understand. The first one is the bipartisanship I already spoke to, that we have a shared vision as a nation on this, if not on anything else. An illustration of this, I think, that is such a perfect illustration in my mind is that the infrastructure law itself, the IIJA, had bipartisan votes, but it did not get most Republican votes. And yet, even Republicans who voted against it, such as Senator Cruz, then immediately introduced a bill, and Senator Cruz did this, so again, nice to be here in Texas talking about this. He introduced a bill for broadband infrastructure spending that was largely identical to the piece of the IIJA that was about broadband infrastructure spending. The pieces of the IIJA that were not bipartisan or not 100% bipartisan were, well, let me put it otherwise. The one piece of the IIJA that I think had universal support was the broadband piece. And I'm so encouraged by that. So that's theme number one. And you will build here within the state on that basis, as we will in every state. The second one is, I talked a few minutes ago about availability, meaning infrastructure and services, and then access, meaning true adoption, affordability, and all the pieces that come with it, the things that are necessary to have as building blocks before one can even avail oneself of that availability. One of the key themes of what is coming out of Washington right now is that those two things have to be integrated. They can't be seen as separate silos. And this is going to be a really important piece of planning here at the state and at the local level, as it will be in every state. For a long time, everything was about infrastructure only. That was the primary focus. And then there was this kind of side conversation about, oh yeah, and then there are people who can't afford, and we should think about that as well. What we see now in terms of the way the federal government is structuring the funding, and I won't go into all kinds of detail about the notices of funding opportunity that they released last Friday, because it's hundreds of pages of detail about this, and I can certainly answer questions about it, but what you should know is that they are requiring that states see these two things as related to each other and plan each one in light of the other. There are multiple pots of funding in the IIJA. The bulk of it is for infrastructure, but there's a substantial pot for affordability, adoption. In the language of Washington these days, they call it digital equity. In some states, we just say digital opportunity, but all of those things around skills and affordability and access to devices and so on. And these are no longer siloed. The planning has to take them into account, and the awardees of the infrastructure funds have to have plans around inclusion and equity and adoption programs have to be integrated with infrastructure programs. That's a really good thing. It makes for a certain amount of complexity, but it will also make for much, much better outcomes. Because, as I said a few minutes ago, if it's this consequential, it should be for everyone. Not just that it should be, but our economy and our future as a nation requires it to be for everyone. Last big picture theme that I think is also incredibly important, and this is another area where there is bipartisan agreement, is that this is not going to be dictated by the federal government. The details of how this gets done will not be determined by the federal government. Congress has trusted the states to make good decisions and has trusted that the states, trusted and will verify that the states reach out to local communities in determining how to make those decisions. And that is a sea change in the way we think about broadband funding, because the more modest funding that we've had in the past has been very much federal government will award grants on a competitive basis, bring your best projects to the federal government and we'll make the award. This is a completely different approach. Quite frankly, the FCC has been entirely removed from the picture Maybe not entirely. The FCC is developing a map that will be pretty consequential to all of this, but it is not in any kind of decision-making position. Within certain guardrails, the states will be making the decisions, and the states are absolutely obligated under the rules and under the statute to collaborate with and consult with local communities. That is a really, really good sign. One other element of that collaboration piece is public and private. So it's not only going to be state and local, it's also going to be public and private. The bulk of these funds are going to go to private companies. You know, in the language of one of our earlier speakers today, as red-blooded Americans, we know that is our system, that is how our economy functions, that is a great thing. We have, you know, this miraculous economy as Americans, this amazing thing that functions incredibly well. The bulk of those funds will go to private companies, but this is public money, and it comes with obligations, and it comes with reasonable strings attached. And some of determination of what those obligations and strings attached are will be in the hands of local communities collaborating with the state, because this is going to be the infrastructure that determines our future, and for that reason, it has to be taken care of, it has to be addressed in ways that the recipients of public funds are responsible to the needs of our communities. Those are the overall themes. Now let me, in 2 minutes, try to get through 20 slides, which I think is probably not going to work very well. Can I have the next one, please? I will happily share all of these slides, and if anybody is interested in my opinions on public-private partnerships, I've written a whole lot of papers, and these slides are based on them, and I can certainly send them to you or tell you where to find them. A few thoughts on how to think about this if you are a community, how you can shape that investment in ways that could be consequential for you. And can you just scroll through, and I'll tell you when to stop. One more, and one more. Yes, there we go. One more. Thank you. That's perfect. Thanks. For local communities, what I'd like to share is that if we think about the ways in which you can have input and impact, certainly you should be talking to the state at all times, you should be talking to companies, all the things you would expect. But one way to understand in a sort of simplified way, the way local communities are able to exert significant influence in the current moment is that there are 3 general models. And many of the projects we see emerging around the country have elements of 2 or even all 3 of these, but a simplification, a generalization to help you understand the models is that the first one is the local community facilitates a private company in its investment. And that facilitation, facilitation is number 1. Grant making of local funds is number 2. And public investment in infrastructure that is made available to the private sector is number 3. Can I have the next slide? The other direction. And again, actually, I'm sorry, the other direction. Sorry to make this hard. There we go. Okay, so model 1, facilitation, very, very simplified. The private sector will do better, have lower costs and higher revenues if it collaborates with local communities. Most competitive companies understand this. Many of the large incumbent companies understand this also. Increasingly, I think there is a willingness and understanding on the private sector side to work with local communities toward win-win outcomes. And the brief version of understanding what this entails is really that through local effort and facilitation, it is possible to improve the economics for the private sector. You bring down costs by sharing information, sharing infrastructure, streamlining processes, bring up revenues by helping to bring folks who are not currently connected onto the networks where they usually through the Affordable Connectivity Program, the federal program, now can become revenue opportunities for those private companies. And quite frankly, where public support from the local community, the county or the city or the town can also become a key to unlocking some of that funding that's going to flow through the states. And I can't overemphasize that particular point because I think it's a really big deal. I am hoping that every state looks at the history of broadband grant making in the past 10 years and recognizes the significant best practice that we get better outcomes if the local community is part of the decision-making apparatus, and that there is not just additional points, but even ideally requirements for local participation, that successful private grantees will have the support of that local community. And that's going to be a two-way street. The local community will make contributions and will put in effort. There will be sweat associated with it, but the consultation with the local community and meeting its needs will be part of what makes a grantee worthy and attractive for grant making. Can I have the next one, please? And some of that may involve grant making by the community itself. The fiscal recovery funds of ARPA are really the only funds that came to all of your communities that are unrestricted, well, not unrestricted, but relatively flexible, and that you can spend on broadband if you choose. That is the one bucket of funding that cities and counties and towns have access to and can use for this purpose. And grant making, selective and strategic grant making in this area, in order to increase the chances of a private company wanting to invest in your community, having access to state funds, et cetera, is a way in which your communities can, if those funds are available and if this is a priority, help to shape that private investment and differentiate yourselves from other places. Can I have the next one? And finally, speaking of public investment, there is a set of models that have existed for a while, but we're seeing a lot more of these days, of communities using their own funds, including those ARPA fiscal recovery dollars, to build assets that are then made available to private companies based on mutually agreeable and enforceable terms, so that the community is investing in itself at the same time as it's not necessarily taking on the risk of going into the internet business, but is enabling its private partners. There's a lot more detail around that and all of these models, but I want to share those three big frameworks so that you all understand the ways in which your communities can do more than just asking the state to represent your interests, but can take a very active role in ensuring that the companies that are going to build and operate and profit in your communities and leverage public funding from the state that all of us as taxpayers have made available to them, that they are meeting your needs as well, that you have agency in all of this, and you can approach it strategically, and you can encourage the state to enable, support, and facilitate this. That is, a 4-hour presentation condensed into the last 3 minutes. I would really love, I have 9 minutes and 27 seconds left, and Kelty and I discussed that if you all are interested in asking questions or presenting your own thoughts on what I've presented, I would love to be able to have a discussion here, given that I have the flexibility to be able to ask for that. So rather than me just talking, let me ask all of you questions or comments. Sir. This is a spectacular question. The question is, as a county, how can we use funds or leverage state funds, et cetera, without picking winners and losers to help all of our private providers? So it's really a good question, right? Because this could be a very sticky position for a community to be in the current moment, The state over the next few years is going to roll out a series of programs, grant programs that will enable primarily private entities to go out and build, and hopefully the state will want consultation and input from the county. So here's my sense of the answer. I think the communities that have been most successful to date in doing this have used competitive process. Because it is, there's a reason why we have competitive process in government. It is because it's fair. It's because, or it increases the fairness of the outcome. And what this really comes down to is consultation with all of those private companies to understand what their interests are, and then to build strategy around that. But critically also understanding of what your needs as a county are and what the needs of your community, your institutions, your businesses, and your residents are, and then to build a strategy around the outcome you would like to achieve. Then use a competitive process to determine what entity or group of entities, because there might be multiple entities, is most likely, if they are able to access the funds that the state will be giving out, to meet the needs that you have identified as being yours. And associated with that, some of the things that I talked about here, some of the things that a county can put on the table, data, assets, streamlined process, support for a state grant application, all of that are things that you can offer as part of that collaboration. That competitive process can help you to identify who is the best company, or which are the best companies for different parts of my county, who will meet my needs, and to make a promise. Based on that, we will put in X dollars, and by the way, I'm not saying you all should put in money, I'm just saying it's one of the tools you have if you wish to, or we will make these other things available, and most consequentially, we will support your grant application to the state. Now, some of this will depend on how the state builds out its grant programs, right? That we don't know yet what that will look like, but we do know, based on the notice of funding opportunity that the federal government released on Friday, that the federal government will require the state to take very seriously the opinions and the needs of local communities, and that's an excellent place to be. Long answer to your question. The short answer is competitive process. Okay, sir.
I've been building broadband networks for almost 26 years. And for the first time, I'm here, I'm going to speak up. For the first time, municipalities, counties, you have the control. Ensure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, you're getting the things that are necessary for your communities. I have built some of these networks for major providers, yet have not received anything from a city that is substantial to support it. You're in control, you're in the driver's seat, and you should be able to make those decisions to ensure that your folks in your counties and cities are getting what's necessary. I think it's absolutely imperative as kind of move forward, because that's where we're at. The other thing is I've been to multiple different meetings across the state, mostly around the Houston area, Victoria, and I've also had conversations across the country, because I do business development across the entire country, and it's so imperative that you start opening the doors and start having conversations. I knock down doors, I talk to a lot of people, I talk to co-ops, I talk to telephone co-ops, I talk to providers, and everybody tends to kind of close the door because they want to go after the funding themselves. And I implore you at this point, you got to open the doors, talk to people, sign NDAs. If you don't like it, walk out, Put your cards on the table, talk about these things, because there are folks across the country that would like to come in here to Texas, and they would like to build it themselves, and that funding is somewhere else. So as we're sitting here and we're fighting amongst ourselves, that funding is someone else is creating a consortium, and they're creating that additional dollars to meet the 25%, and they'd love to come in here and build this network to go through your town and counties, and you won't see anything. You'll just see somebody out there building fiber and putting permits in, and you're like, hey, what happened? Because we're too busy not having those conversations. So I would implore everybody, because I'm a Texan, I went in the military, went to combat vet here, and I'm telling you, I'd love to see this come back to sit there in Texas. The revenues come back here, because there's people that are fighting to get that federal funding for your county and also for these cities out here.
You know, one thing I should point out, thank you. The thing that you can be most confident about that I think is really important is that you don't have to worry about losing out on your funding to other states. The funding allocation that Congress created is formula-based. And that formula for the digital equity funds is based on population, based on eligible populations, a variety of other things. I won't go into too much detail, but it's really formula-based and not much that you can do to change it. And the allocation, the formula for the infrastructure funds is based on the relative percentage of unserved locations and high-cost unserved locations. My expectation is that Texas is going to get probably somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. I mean, honestly, it might even be more than that. You're going to be the biggest awardee for a variety of reasons that have to do with the size of your state and the amount of locations that are not currently served. And you're not likely to lose any of that to other states. How it gets distributed within Texas and the wisdom with which it gets distributed is going to be the key set of issues, and the degree to which local communities have input to that. And to this gentleman's point, you as communities will have that influence if you choose to exert it. Proceed with extreme caution, as Dr. Ali said earlier today. There are a lot of people out there who will try to sell you snake oil. They will promise you all kinds of miraculous outcomes. This is not going to be miraculous. It's not going to be easy. It's actually going to be really, really challenging. But as communities, hopefully you have the opportunity to exert influence. I don't know that I would say you're quite in control. I don't think the law set things up that way. The states are really in control. But to some degree, communities will be gatekeepers if the state really listens to the counties and the towns and the cities, and I think it will, because I think that is all baked into the new understanding of the consequences of this infrastructure. And so you are in a position to really advocate for your communities. And that means doing serious due diligence on the companies and making sure that when you do select partners, when you do select entities that you want to invest your time, your funds, and your assets in, you are sure that they will make real promises to you, serious promises, and that they will take those promises seriously. Any other questions or comments? Ma'am.
Lived in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I remember the city of Lafayette wanted to set up fiber. And one of the providers took the city of Lafayette to court. And I don't know what happened to the case because I moved to Texas. And looking at the judicial system, it's probably still in court. But my question is, we are talking about collaboration here. How are we going to ensure that the providers are not going to take communities to court because they want to be the sole provider of broadband for that community?
Yeah, it's a really good set of questions. The city of Lafayette, Louisiana has built a municipal fiber to the premises network and was challenged in court multiple times by incumbent providers who felt that public investment felt unfair. By the way, incumbent providers no longer say they have a problem with public investment. They're seeing $42.5 billion, and they're all in on public investment. So now that's a good thing. Public ownership is much more complex, I think. There are a couple of hundred municipalities out there that very ably run municipal broadband networks, but it's only a couple of hundred out of many thousands of communities, and I think it's not the solution to our broadband challenges. It's going to be incremental in some places, and I really admire the communities that do that. I just don't think it's our only option. The question that is presented here that I think is so important is how do we build bonds or how do we build collaborations with private companies as communities where we know that our needs will be met and that it's a real partnership as opposed to something where, as in the case of Lafayette, they got sued. And I think this relates to what I said to the gentleman here. Oh, I am out of time. Okay, let me finish the answer. I promise this is the last one. That competitive process will ideally lead to enforceable commitments on both sides. And this is to the point that Dr. Ali made this morning about you need a partner you can really trust. You don't want to buy snake oil. And then you want contracts where if you as a community are putting something on the table, and it might just be as simple as your support for an application to the state for funding, that you are making that promise, you will follow through on that promise, and your private partner will follow through on its promise, and that there are contracts in place that make all of that enforceable. That we're not doing this just based on trust or promises on one side but not on the other side, but we're making enforceable commitments. I think the key insight there is you may not have control here, but you have influence. Your vote matters. It is important where you are as a community and how you come into this process. And the state will take that seriously, and the federal government will require that the state take it seriously. So this is your moment to think about your strategy, to think about what you bring to the table and how attractive you can make your community for private investment and for public funds, and then to make sure that your needs are taken care of in an enforceable way as part of that discussion and that negotiation. And thank you all so much. It's really been a pleasure being here.